everybody. My name is Dolores O'Riordan. I'm the director of UCD's Institute of Food and Health. You're all very welcome to tonight's public health lecture from the Institute. So these series of lectures are designed to give you, the public, the latest scientific evidence on topics that are considered of interest to you in the area of food and health. And tonight our talk is going to be on the very important area of nutrition and mental health. So to speak this evening, we have Professor Lorraine Brennan. So Lorraine is head of human nutrition at UCD, and she's a researcher at the Institute of Food and Health and the Conway Institute. Her research is in the area of metabolic phenotyping and personalized nutrition. She leads very large-scale research, including a US-Ireland grant on cardiometabolic health, and a very important initiative, which is an all-Ireland project on Protein I, looking at new forms of protein intake on the island of Ireland. Lorraine does a lot of public engagement, and included in that is an initiative with Journal Frontiers to make science more accessible to kids. So the format this evening is that Lorraine is going to present the latest evidence in terms of nutrition and mental health. At the end of Lorraine's talk, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Brendan Harold. Brendan is a dietitian manager for mental health service in Dublin South, Wicklow West and Kildare. His background is in biochemistry, but he also has qualifications in human nutrition and in dietetics and an MSc in healthcare leadership. Brendan has worked for 15 years clinically as a dietitian and in many areas, including mental health, disabilities, and rehabilitation. And he also lectures on nutrition and mental health, both in UCD and UL. So we've got great scientific credentials here this evening. As I say, Brendan will be on hand to answer any of your questions. So during the course of Lorraine's talk, if you want to pose your questions in the Q&A tab of the call here. And then at the end of the talk, my colleague, Associate Professor Claire Corrish, will moderate your questions and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. I know many of you are often interested in the contents of the talk, so it will be made available to you. Both the slides and the recording will be on the UCD Institute of Food and Health's website within a short time frame from this evening. So I'll now pass you over to Lorraine, and she's going to commence her talk. And you're all very welcome here this evening. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Dolores, and thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm delighted to be here with you this evening to talk to you about nutrition and mental health, some of the latest perspectives from the scientific evidence viewpoint. So over the next 30 minutes or so, what I hope to do is to take you through some of the scientific evidence that there is to support food recommendations for mental health. And then I'm going to touch at the end on some of the exciting emerging evidence that there is in the whole area. So to start with, we've all seen images like this. So the one on our left, boost your mood with healthy food. Eating a healthy, balanced diet is proven to have a positive impact on how you feel. And one on the right is one taken from the BBC, which recently done a series of articles linking food with mental health. So what I want to do tonight is really to take you through some of the evidence that really supports these statements and shows that we do have scientific evidence to back these up. So where do we get this evidence? Well, from a nutrition and diet perspective, we generally tend to get our evidence from multiple different sources. And working in the area of diet and mental health is actually very difficult. And I'll come back to that in the next slide. But essentially, this is our pyramid of evidence, where we have evidence on the bottom layers down here at the bottom. So we're talking about editorials and mechanistic studies. And these are what we would call lower quality evidence. And then as we move up through this pyramid, what we have is higher quality evidence. So we have here our cross-sectional studies, our case-controlled studies, and our cohort studies. And in these types of studies, what we essentially do is we observe individuals, we observe what they're eating, and we observe the conditions that they have at that particular time or at a later time in life if they are longitudinal cohort studies. And then what we can do is we can look at observational or correlations or associations between diet and the health impacts or the disease outcomes we're interested in. And what I'm going to talk about mostly tonight will be looking at the associations between dietary intake and depression. And we will look at data from these observational studies. While they are classified as having lower quality of evidence and potentially also having a higher risk of bias, they're actually really important, and they build that evidence base that we have, and they build that evidence base so that we can go on to do up here on top these randomized controlled trials, which are what we call the gold standard in the field. So these randomized controlled trials are really trying to see if we can link diet with mental health and prove a causation between the two. But I will say again that we do use evidence from all of these different areas. We acknowledge that some of the evidence is only correlations, and we acknowledge that there could be a higher risk of bias in them. But together, and if used correctly together, can really develop a strong evidence base for us to work with. When we're working with diet, and when we're working with diet in particular with mental health, there are lots of methodological issues that which we have to deal with. And I'm going to touch on a few of these just to give you a flavour of how difficult it can be. And number one, it's very difficult to assess what people are eating. And this is very true in most of the nutrition studies that we do. And the reason being is that people will tend to over-report foods that they perceive to be healthy and under-report foods that they perceive to be unhealthy. We often focus on single nutrients or single foods, and as a result, we can forget about dietary patterns, and we potentially then the message back to the public can become very difficult if we really go down single foods, nutrients. So again, the push at the moment is to try and think about the whole diet and the whole dietary pattern. When we're working with diet and mental health, we have to be aware that there is a bi-directional relationship between them. That is, that if somebody has a poor mental health status, they might not feel that they have the energy or the will to eat and cook properly, and as a result, their diet may become poor. So that bi-directional relationship is very important when we're looking at studies as well. And then finally, when we're doing randomized controlled trials, although I said they are our gold standard, they are very problematic to run in nutrition, in the nutrition field. So for example, adherence can be very difficult for individuals. It's very difficult for us as researchers to measure adherence. And often when we're working with whole foods and whole food studies, we can't be double-blinded in our studies. So it can be very difficult to develop the same quality of evidence that we would have, for example, in pharmaceutical trials. Nonetheless, saying all of that and acknowledging that there are methodological issues, there is some very exciting and strong evidence that's emerging in the field of nutrition and mental health. So as I said, in the recent years, these studies are emerging, and that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. And there is the whole emergence of the field of nutritional psychiatry, which again is very exciting in the field. So I want to just quickly put up this slide again, just to very much acknowledge that while I'm going to talk about the relationship between food and diet and mental health, that it has to be also thought of in a larger ecosystem, that diet also impacts our physical health, and our physical health then can impact our mental health. So we're only touching on a very small part of a larger ecosystem, and I think that's very important to acknowledge upfront as well. So what is the evidence? So let's get straight to it. So I'm going to start with these observational studies, and I'm going to look at what has come out of those in the last 5 years in terms of systematic reviews. This means when you look at all of the data together, what is the emerging evidence? I'm going to look at it from a perspective of dietary indices, so focusing on indices that measure our adherence to the Mediterranean diet. So this is a style of diet that is eaten in Mediterranean countries. Looking at the adherence to the healthy guidelines in terms of the healthy eating index, and looking at it in terms of our inflammatory diet, that is the dietary inflammatory index. So what has emerged if we look at these observational studies? So people in the highest category of adherence to the Mediterranean diet have lower odds or lower risk of instant depressive outcomes. So that means that if you're eating more of a Mediterranean diet, you will have a lower risk of instant depressive outcomes. And this is what's showing from the observational data. In terms of the healthy eating index, there is an inverse association between the healthy eating index and prevalence of depression. And that means, again, if you have a diet that is of a higher diet quality, you will have a lower risk of depression. And in terms of the association between the inflammatory dietary index, again, there is an association between the inflammatory diet index and the prevalence of depression. So this basically summarizes all of the literature that's out there in terms of the observational evidence in linking diet quality or dietary indices and depression. So what you can conclude when you look at all of that data? Well, you can conclude that there is robust association between both higher adherence to a Mediterranean diet and lower adherence to a pro-inflammatory diet and a lower risk of depression. Similar trends were seen for the healthy eating index. And if you look across these different dietary indices, what you find are common elements. And the common elements are that these diets tend to be higher in fruits, higher in vegetables, have a higher nut intake, and have lower intakes of processed meats, red meats, and importantly, alcohol in moderation. So I've tried to depict that in that little cartoon at the bottom. So we're talking about increases or higher intakes of fruit and vegetables and nuts on the left, and a lower intake of processed meats and alcohol in moderation. So last year in 2021, there was an update again in looking at a systematic review and a meta-analysis of the data, this time in older adults. And what this found was something very similar. And you can see the outcomes here. So if you look here at the line where it says 1, so if there was no effect of the healthy dietary pattern on depression risk, the dot would be on 1. On the left, it means that there is a lower depression risk, and on the right, it means that there's a higher depression risk. And you can see that most of the studies are lying on the left of the 1. And what the authors concluded was that the healthy dietary patterns characterized by higher intakes of vegetables, fruits, legumes, beans, and fish were associated with a reduced risk of depression in older adults. So if we take this together then with the other diet, the other information that we've seen from the observational study, what we can conclude is that adhering to a healthy diet, in particular to a Mediterranean diet, appears to confer some protection against depression in observational studies. And again, we have to be very careful that these are observational studies. We're just looking at correlations and associations between the diet and the depression outcomes. However, what's really important is that similar results are emerging from a very large age range and from very diverse cultures around the world. So it's not just that one particular group are finding it in one particular population group, but if you look at the literature on a whole, this is what's emerging. Importantly also, evidence is emerging from studies using a range of different methods to assess diet, and that avoids us introducing risk of the measurement of diet into our observational studies, and also a range of methods for assessing mental health. And then if we look at all of that together, this really provides a reasonable evidence base to assess the role of dietary interventions to prevent depression. So these observational studies are really providing the evidence base for us to go forward and to try look at this further in randomized controlled trials, or RCTs as we call them. So if we go back here, what I've just talked to you about are these interventions that are down here are these observation studies that are cohorts, case controls and cross-sectionals, and I've just tried to summarize the emerging evidence from them. And now what I want to do is to focus on what evidence we have from randomized controlled trials. And I'm going to focus on the Mediterranean diet because that's where a lot of the information and the stronger evidence comes from. So this picture depicts what a Mediterranean diet is. So first thing, the Mediterranean diet is about eating socially and having a social interaction around food. The bottom level here indicates that these foods are consumed daily. So you have whole grains, beans, legumes, nuts and seeds, and daily consumption of these. And these will form the main basis of the diet. Vegetables are consumed, and a wide range of vegetables are consumed daily. Extra virgin olive oil and about 3 to 4 tablespoons are used daily. And then seafood is used a few times per week, and dairy products and poultry are used in probably once to twice a week in small portions. And up on top, we have really a reduction in red meat and in cakes and biscuits, and really eating these occasionally or in small portions. On the left here, then, we have red wine. Red wine is consumed as part of the Mediterranean diet, but it is in moderation. It's a small glass of red wine that they consume once a day, and with no increased consumption of the wine during weekends, for example. So it is really red wine in moderation. So that's what the definition of a Mediterranean diet is. So what are the studies then that have looked to try see if they intervene with individuals with a Mediterranean diet, can they improve the depression? So the first one I'm going to just highlight briefly is a study called the SMILE study, which was conducted in Australia, and they looked at performing a randomized controlled trial of dietary improvements for adults with major depression. This was a 12-week study where they had 2 groups, the dietary group and a control group. So the dietary group were intervened with dietitians to enable the participants to undergo a change in their diet, which they called a modified Mediterranean diet, and I'll come back to that in a few slides' time, or a control group, which is a social group. And the primary outcome were depression symptoms. And the hypothesis they had was that if people followed the Mediterranean diet, they would improve their depression symptoms. So the modified Mediterranean diet they used was a diet rich in vegetables, fruit, whole grains, oily fish, about 4 tablespoons of olive oil, legumes and nuts. And they allowed moderate consumption of red meat and dairy. And if we look at that, you can see here in this triangle down at the bottom, these are the foods that they consumed daily. So whole grains really formed the base of the diet. So they had 5 to 8 servings of whole grains, 3 servings of fruit, 6 servings of vegetables a day, and 2 to 3 servings of dairy, olive oil, around between 3 and 4 tablespoons, and 1 serving of nuts per day. So this is the diet on a daily basis. And then on a weekly basis, they had legumes, 3 or 4 servings, red meat, 3 to 4 servings in a week, and they had at least 2 servings of fish. And they had moderate alcohol consumption on a weekly basis, and then they encouraged daily exercise, and then to enjoy the social aspects of eating and enjoy meals with others. So what did they find? Well, they found that the Mediterranean diet group improved their depression scores, and to show you that, I just took this snapshot from the food medic, who is a medic, but also a registered GP and registered dietitian in the UK. And this is a very nice image of what they found. So 32% of the people in the dietary support group went into remission and 8% only in the social group. So really strong effects of the Mediterranean diet improving the depression scores in this group. So what can you conclude from this study? Well, it provides strong evidence for the dietary improvement as a treatment strategy. It also showed that you can work with patients that have mental illness, in this case depression, to help them improve their dietary intake. However, the sample size was small and replication is needed in larger studies. But overall, if we conclude from this SMILE study, following the 12-week modified Mediterranean diet, there was a significantly greater improvement in the depression scores in the dietary support group. And the foods that they used are dietary patterns rich in vegetables, fruit and whole grain, oily fish, olive oil, legumes and nuts, and moderate consumption of red meat and dairy. So there was another study I'm going to highlight again. This is our highest level of evidence. This is our randomized controlled trial, again with the Mediterranean diet, and this is called the Healthy Med study. And again, in a very similar fashion, they had two groups. They had the Mediterranean diet group and they had a social group. It was a 3-month intervention, but they also followed up these individuals at 6-month time point. And what did they do? For the Mediterranean diet group, they worked with them in cooking workshops, again, trying to encompass part of the Mediterranean diet into their daily diets. And they gave them fortnightly hampers. And in this instance, they gave them fish oil supplements. In the social group, they worked with them in social workshops. They played games, they had book clubs, and they completed personality questionnaires with them as well. So what did they find? Well, in the Mediterranean diet group, you can see it here at 3 months is in green, starting off is in blue, and you can see that these bars indicate the diet quality or the adherence to the Mediterranean diet in this instance. And you can see a significant improvement in the adherence to the Mediterranean diet following the 3-month intervention in the Med diet group, and no significant difference in the social group. So the question then is, did this improvement in the Mediterranean diet group have an impact on the depression scores in these individuals? And you can see that over here, the depression scores reduced. So this is starting again blue in baseline, and then 3 months later, they decreased. They also decreased in the social group, but not to the same extent as in the Mediterranean diet group. And if you look at it as a percentage improvement, the depression scores improved by 45% in the Mediterranean diet group. So what can we conclude from these two randomized controlled trials? The data shows great promise for the role of nutrition in the prevention and treatment of depression. However, more studies are needed to replicate these findings in wider population groups. Now, there have been some other studies since these two studies, and again, they're showing positive impact and positive outcomes in terms of the Mediterranean diet. So this is, I guess, all very well. And when you talk about this to people, they'll say, but I live in Ireland. I don't live in the Mediterranean. How am I going to eat a Mediterranean diet? And this might feel very alien to people to talk about the Mediterranean diet, and it can put up a barrier a barrier to change. So there has been a big shift in trying to get people to think about the Mediterranean diet or aspects of the Mediterranean diet and how to incorporate it into their own daily dietary pattern. And I've took this from the British Dietetics Association, and this was just some very simple tips on how you can move your traditional dietary pattern towards a Mediterranean diet. So trying to take some of those beneficial aspects and introducing them into your diet. So the first one is maximizing intakes of fruits and vegetables. So I think we all can do that. And for many of us, it's introducing beans, chickpeas and lentils into our diet. So these may be foods that aren't so highly consumed in many people's diets. It's opting for the whole grain options. So whole grain bread, whole grain pasta, whole grain rice. It's thinking about reducing the intake of red meat, having at least 2 portions of fish per week, one of which should be oily fish, and eating moderate amounts of dairy products here. For many of us, it's using olive oil or introducing the use of olive oil into our daily foods. So using olive oil for salads and cooking. And it's limiting the intake of beverages, meals and snacks that are high in saturated fat, sugar and salt. And it is alcohol in moderation. So, and that's really, really important down here at the bottom as well. So these are some general tips about how to move towards a Mediterranean diet without having to completely shift the way in which we eat. There are other good options on the website for helping people to move towards a Mediterranean diet. So this I took from Heart Health in the UK. And these are foods where they're saying to try eat less of, not to remove them completely, but to pay attention and try to reduce and swap them with healthier options. So for example, to reduce butter, to reduce white bread, pasta and rice, and to replace it with whole grain bread, pasta and rice, to reduce breakfast cereals such as cornflakes and potentially increase oats and porridge for breakfast, reduce sweets, biscuits and cakes, and takeaways, burgers, fatty meat, etc. So these are foods where they're saying to eat less of. Again, it's not to reduce completely or to eliminate, but to try eat less of. And then these are examples of foods where you can eat more of. And again, it's olive oil. It's using olive oil in our daily meals, whole grain breads, brown rice, brown pasta, having porridge for breakfast is possible, oat cereals and wheat biscuits. And for many of us, it's introducing nuts into our diet, and really importantly, the unsalted versions of nuts, introducing lentils, beans and peas, and using seafood and oily fish 2 to 3 times a week. So these are just, and again, I've given you the website at the bottom, some tips of how to try potentially move towards aspects of a Mediterranean diet and incorporate some of those foods that are coming up as being important in the Mediterranean diet. The other question then is about cost and affordability of all of this. People often think that moving towards these diets, and in particular the Mediterranean diet, is going to be of a higher cost. Surprisingly, that first study that I showed you, that SMILE study, when they costed what people were eating before the intervention, and then they costed the price of the food during the intervention, the food in the modified Mediterranean diet was about 25 Australian dollars cheaper per week. So there are ways of trying to eat towards a Mediterranean diet or a modified Mediterranean diet in an affordable manner. And again, there's a link to a website that will give you some tips on this here. But some very quick tips are to try use seasonal vegetables. These tend to be cheaper than having to buy fruits and vegetables that you think are coming from the Mediterranean. We can use local seasonal vegetables to increase our fruit and veg intake. We can also supplement and try increase our vegetable and fruit intake using frozen fruit and veg. We can introduce beans and lentils using canned, as long as we make sure that we're using the unsalted and unsweetened versions of these canned beans and lentils. And of course, canned fish are also a very good source of omega-3 and good oils, and to supplement into our diets. So there are, I focus very much on the Mediterranean diet, and that's where the bulk of the evidence comes from, but there are other emerging evidence, and for the last remaining few minutes, I'm going to just talk about those. There are some nutrients and foods that people always ask about, and I've tried to put them up here and just highlight them very quickly. We are giving very much a food-based approach here, talking about foods and dietary patterns, but people will always be interested to hear about, well, is iron important? And you can see here that if you're low in iron, you will feel tired and lethargic, and that can have, of course, a knock-on effect on mood. And the foods then that are going to help with this are making sure you're getting enough iron, particularly from red meat, poultry, fish, beans and pulses, and fortified cereals. And the key tip here is to avoid eating these foods and drinking tea at the same time, because tea can impact the absorption of the iron. B vitamins, people often ask about B vitamins as well, and there is some evidence emerging that B vitamins can have an effect on feeling depressed or irritable. And again, it's about including foods that will ensure that you're getting enough B vitamins, and these are your whole grain cereals, some animal foods such as meat, fish, eggs and dairy. Folic acid or folate, again, there's evidence that's emerging that's showing that increased chance of feeling depressed with low levels of folate. And this can be particularly important in older people from the evidence that's emerging. And folate then can be found in green leafy vegetables, oranges, citrus fruits, beans, and other fortified cereals such as breakfast cereals. Selenium is another mineral that people often ask about, and there is emerging evidence that it may increase the incidence of feeling depressed. Again, the evidence isn't as strong as the evidence that I've shown you in relation to the Mediterranean diet, but foods that can help with selenium levels are Brazil nuts, meat, fish, seeds, and wholemeal bread. But either way, the food approach, as you can see from here, will, if you're eating that healthy dietary pattern, you will get these nutrients and these minerals from that healthy dietary pattern. So finally then, the other area that's really emerging, and there's great excitement about it, is about the potential interaction between our gut and our brain. And really what has emerged in the last few years is that the microbes in our gut that are living in our gut can produce signals in terms of small molecules that can signal and interact with our brain. The evidence is emerging. It is still largely in animal studies, but we're starting to see some emerging evidence now in humans that there is definitely an interaction between those microbes and our brain. But either way, diet impacts those microbes and impacts the gut microbiota, and having a healthy diet and a healthy dietary pattern will allow the beneficial microbes to grow, and those beneficial microbes are taught to produce small molecules such as short chain fatty acids, which then have a positive impact on your brain. So the emerging evidence is really that a healthy microbiome may be a useful dietary strategy for mental health. But as I said, most of this evidence to date is coming from animal studies, but some very exciting work also emerging in the human context. So just to put this in context, this is an image that I took from a recent paper, and what they're trying to get across here is the importance of food and what we eat, and how that has a direct importance on our brain, but actually also on the microbes that are present in our gut, and also that food is metabolized in the microbes, and then those metabolized in the gut, and again those molecules can signal back to the brain. So a very exciting area, I think, an area that is emerging, and I think in future years we will learn a lot more about this. But as I mentioned at the outset of this talk, this is extremely difficult to study in humans, and extremely difficult to decipher potential underlying mechanisms. Not said, this is the first time that I've seen actually a potential diagram trying to understand the mechanisms that could potentially link a healthy diet with alleviating depression. And this, as from a scientific point of view, is really exciting, because what I've shown you today is evidence from observational studies, evidence from intervention studies, but now we're actually talking about potential mechanisms. And this is really important for us to drive the field forward and to really be providing convincing evidence that we have a link between a healthy diet and depression outcomes. And then finally, then, just to wrap it up and to try and put it into context, I hope I've shown you over the last 30 minutes or so that dietary improvements can be considered to support traditional treatment methods. They should not replace them. They should be used as an adjunctive therapy to treatment methods in it. It is part of a larger ecosystem and part of a larger treatment strategy. The evidence is emerging to support an important role of a healthy diet. The field is emerging and likely to make significant impact in coming years. And I think from the outset, it's really, really important that you get your information from registered dietitians or registered nutritionists, and that if you're doing any studies or any work, to make sure that you're involving them in the delivery of the advice. So taking all of that together, a group of scientists and clinicians across the globe came together to see if they could come up with some recommendations for the prevention of depression. And they came up with 5 very simple guidelines. And the first one was that we should follow traditional dietary patterns, such as the Mediterranean diet or the Nordic diet. So the Nordic diet is essentially a Mediterranean diet, but using foods from Nordic countries. So what I've tried to show you today as well is that you can use your traditional diet and you can make sure that you're bringing in elements of the Mediterranean diet without having to completely switch to eating and buying foods that are produced in the Mediterranean countries. The basics are: increase your consumption of fruit, vegetables, legumes, whole grain cereals, nuts and seeds. Try to increase your consumption of fish to make sure you have foods that are rich in omega-3. These are our polyunsaturated fatty acids. Limit your intake of fast foods, commercial bakery goods and sweets, and to replace unhealthy foods with wholesome, nutritious foods. So these are the 5 guiding principles that these recommendations have come forward with. So with that, I'm trying to put those into pictures. So it is eating a rainbow of fruit and vegetables, if possible. Really thinking about whole grain options, so whole grain bread, whole grain rice, whole grain pasta. Try introduce some oily fish, and if possible, try to start using and incorporating olive oil into your diet. So to wrap it up then, I have put up some resources that I think people will find useful. So the first one is some good tips on how to eat a Mediterranean diet. The second one are tips on how moving towards a Mediterranean diet, using your traditional diet, but supplementing it and making sure that you're moving towards a Mediterranean diet. And the last one is eating on a budget, and it is a dietitian approved budget-friendly Mediterranean diet recipe. So really nice recipes in there that are very easy to cook and implement. So with that, I'm going to thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.